decided to dive into his backstory. The stranger told me his name, something I still don't remember, and that he'd very recently been released from prison. He was moving along the coastline on his way to Miami, where he had a job lined up. I nodded along, more interested than you could believe. I could have easily earned an Academy Award with the performance that I put on. Like I was this guy's old high school coach, and he was catching me up on his life or something. Honestly, I wasn't paying attention to what he was saying at all. I was all caught up in a panic, letting one hand rest near the knife in my waistband while looking for signs of aggression in his body language. None ever came, but I was still on high alert. I told the guy that I wished him luck and was going to be turning in soon myself. He said thanks again, then milled around the area for a little bit longer before climbing back into his own van. I saw him light another cigarette and just went back to lounging in the van. For whatever reason, he continued to stare at us. Red flags and alarms had been going off in my head all night, but here I was, somewhere around 2 in the morning, and I hadn't slept any yet. My interaction with that guy was very creepy, but nothing so scary that I needed to run in the other direction. I convinced myself that he was a guy just down on his luck while I put my coffee supplies away, then slipped into the front seat and watched the area for a few minutes before deciding to turn in. But just as I turned to climb back into the bed space with Kat, something caught my eye. I saw movement along the vegetation between the road and the beach, a shadow at first, but soon I could make out the undeniable figure of a man, one even larger than the guy that I was just talking to. He skulked along the underbrush until he was level with the van, then crossed in front of it and climbed into the passenger seat. He was very careful with the handle, as I couldn't hear it open nor latch when he silently pulled it closed. The guy was going the extra mile to make sure that no one knew that he was out there. Great. Not one, but 2 ex-convicts roaming around not 100 feet from where my wife and I are trying to sleep. I slammed the key into the ignition and flooded the area with my high beams. Right there in front of me, I could see both guys sitting in front seats of the van, and they gave me a creepy, rotten grin through the glass. The driver held up the lighter and waved it back and forth at me. My wife asked me what the hell was going on, but I just shifted the car in a drive and whipped around to get deeper into town. The logical thing would have been to blow right past them, so I hadn't been down the stretch of road, and that was literally where they'd come from, but we were definitely more familiar. If I was going to have an advantage, it would be to go where town thickened up and more people could intervene. I'll never forget looking up through my rear view and through the flailing fabrics of the blind, seeing that van peel off the shoulder and come rolling after us. They didn't turn their headlights on, but simply followed along in the dark. I could only see the grille and the headlights by the glow of my red backlights. It was a very haunting visual. I did my best to quickly explain to Kat what the hell was going on, all while she's sliding from wall to wall in the back of the car. I told her that the guy in the van was released from prison this week and had a friend that he didn't mention sneaking around in the dark around our car. As he didn't mention him, I assume his intentions were probably not good. He was likely casing our situation, seeing if we had anything of value. That kind of thing. It only took Kat one peek out of the back window, where she saw the glowing silver grille of that van coming up right behind us, for her to agree that I made the right call. It was time to get the hell out of there, and we had to do it now. Fortunately for us, the neighborhood led right into a well-lit community. Suddenly, that dusty piece of shit van wasn't so scary behind us. They actually looked like assholes, racing and squealing around. They backed off after barely a quarter of a mile and looped back into the darkness near the beach. I drove us to the nearest pharmacy, parked under a light pole, and did my best to fall asleep. The worst-case scenario would be waking up to a ticket, but at that point, I was just lucky to not have been robbed. We lucked out yet again, as Kat and I just snoozed away the morning and woke up without incident. We caught the best lunch that we've ever had, and the cold cuts were unbelievable. We didn't see that van again, and frankly, kind of lost interest in stealth camping. It's been hotels and Airbnbs for us ever since. Personally, I've only ever gone stealth camping one time, and it was during a 2-day drive between where I was going to college and my hometown. The drive itself was about 20 hours. And the town that was smack dab in the middle of that drive was Moab, Utah. I had never been to Moab, but I guess maybe driven through it once. But I'd heard about it just like we all have. That it's paradise for rock climbers, rock crawlers, off-roaders, and outdoorsmen in general. I grew up hiking and camping, so I was kind of excited to see what the town would have to offer for a passerby. As I was planning this trip, I was trying to keep it as cheap as possible. As I mentioned earlier, I was in college at the time, and this was my first trip home for the holidays. I was kind of feeling everything out in terms of what this trip would cost, so I could properly budget out for the future. My first budget cut would be a hotel room. I was driving my old Jeep Cherokee, and Moab was such an outdoor-friendly community. I figured there would be a plethora of campgrounds in that area. I'd just roll into one for one quick overnight for 5 or 6 hours. The day finally came. I packed up my Jeep and hit the road. Everything went exactly to my plan, cutting through the miles until finally, right down at sunset, I got within 10 or 20 miles of Moab. It was so plain out there. No trees or forest from what I could see in the fading sunlight. I didn't worry though. I figured I'd be sleeping in my car anyway. I didn't need trees or forest to do that. By the time I got into Moab though, it was completely dark. I didn't have any idea where to go in terms of camping. This was well before smartphones. So all I had were the Google Map printouts, which I used to piece together a rough idea. Soon I had a campground pegged one just outside of town along the beautiful stretch of the Colorado River. To my memory, it was called Goose Nest Campground, something like 2 miles east of the town limits. Yes, I had Googled if there were campgrounds, but what I failed to learn was that these were paid for, highly sought after campgrounds. I couldn't just roll into one and use it. The second I did this, I had multiple campers from other units walking me down with flashlights, asking to see a permit or some kind of paperwork, anything saying that I paid to be there. It was probably to keep out the riffraff, and after this happening to me 2 or 3 times, I was too spooked to stick around. I didn't feel friendly, and I thought I was ruining a peaceful night for all these campers, not expecting a stranger to come driving through their area. After getting ran out of those campgrounds, I cruised back into Moab, decided I would just sleep in the parking lot, something like a Walmart or a Denny's, where there's a 24-hour bathroom. I didn't really need comfortable living, I just needed basic stuff to get me to morning. I was really banking on sleeping in the middle of nowhere, but my experience thus far had me hesitant to even go off-roading. Who knows what kind of shit I'd come up on out there. There was no luck for me in town either. The place was crawling with crackheads and weirdos. Every parking lot that I investigated had at least one unsavory-looking guy, if not 5 or 6 of them, shuffling around, up to no good. This was not what I had in mind for such a well-known destination. Absolutely defeated, I decided that I would sleep in the middle of nowhere. I got my Jeep back on the highway and rolled maybe 3 miles south of town and hooked onto the first dirt road that I saw. There was a little cattle guard laid in between some barbed wire fencing, but aside from that, the place was wide open. There were some bluffs that I couldn't see over, so I just decided to park along the little ridge that partially blocked my car, still very cautious of my surroundings. I decided to drape one of my blankets that I had across the windshield and the front windows to keep unwanted eyes outside of my cab. Then I insulated myself up front with my legs across the console and button, the driver's seat, my back against the door, and placed my feet in the passenger seat. It definitely wasn't the most comfy thing ever, but I had a lot of stuff packed in the back. Plus, I wanted to be ready if anything got weird. I got to my spot just in time around 9 p.m., way later than I originally planned. My new plan was to catch some quick sleep and be up by 4, get myself ready and back in town, gas up, and then be back on the highway at sunrise around 5 a.m. It was bare minimum, but again, that was all I needed to get through. Literally bare minimum. Basic survival stuff. Something rumbled me awake in the early hours, just before the time that I wanted to be awake. I cracked an eye open, and outside the Jeep was a big dirt hauler, some kind of tractor truck. It was idling, and just around the blanket curtain that I put up, I could see a guy looking down at me from the cab. Not a minute later, he rumbled off into the desert around one of the bluffs and then disappeared. I didn't put much more thought into it and just tried to go back to sleep. I figured it was some kind of laborer of some kind, and this was his pickup route. A truck that size wasn't up to anything spooky. Not but 30 minutes later, I hear banging on the passenger side window. I crack an eye open and checked my watch, just shy of when my alarm was going to go off. I assumed that I was about to get shooed off by the police or maybe the Forest Service, as the timing would line up with the truck that just drove off by earlier. I yanked the blanket down to find an old beater Chevy outside with a guy staring holes through the glass at me. I started to wave, but before I could, someone bangs on the window directly behind my head. They banged on it so hard that it rattled my teeth, and I slowly began to realize I'm completely surrounded. I turn, and sure enough, there's another guy that looks a lot like the first. Plain t-shirt, Levi's boots. They both start hollering for me to get out of the car. For whatever reason, I obliged. I wanted understanding, just to let these guys know that I was just passing through. I meant no harm. This turned out to be a huge mistake on my part. The second that I unlocked the vehicle, the guys yanked both doors open, pulled me out of the car by my arms and my shoulders. Once they had me on the ground, one sat on me while the other went through everything that I had, starting with my glove box. Saying it was a thorough investigation would be an understatement. I watched while this guy turned my front seats upside down, dumped my glove box and console in the dirt, pocketed anything that I had of value. Coins, electronics, you name it. I swear I even saw him take my push-in lighter just because it was shiny. I explained to the guy that was holding me down, I'm a college student. I'm from out of town. I didn't mean any trouble. I was just lost and trying to get some sleep before hitting the road again. The guy literally mocked everything that I said, repeated it back to me in a stupid voice, even slapped me a few times, all while laughing. He didn't care who I was or where I was from. After a few more minutes, the sun crested the hills. Everything was lit up. I don't know how, but I could tell that that made these guys nervous. I could hear cars on the highway, which I thought were closer during the night, and now that I could see it, it was a good quarter-mile away from the main stretch of road. How these guys had found me, I couldn't really be sure. I thought I'd done a pretty damn good job of hiding out. Eventually, after 10 or 15 minutes of being pinned to the ground, they just took off. They instructed me not to follow them, not to call the police, or do anything stupid, because if I did, they'd come back and kill me. They were very, very clear about this when they said it to me. Either way, I'd already made up my mind. They didn't really take much from me, mostly just some food and what little cash I had in front with me. After making sure I was okay and intact, I got back in my Jeep, went back towards Moab. It took me a bit, but after making a couple of laps, I found the police department, went in and made a report. At first, they were pretty dismissive, as I was a college-age student, an out-of-state license, and dirty as hell. I probably looked like a crazy vagrant. Only after I explained where this happened did the officers seem to take one of the deputies asked me. I did my best to explain exactly where I pulled off on the road. The deputy turned back to his superiors, and they talked for a moment, going over some notes of prior reports. It turned out that the guys that had robbed me had been making trouble around town for a couple of weeks, and most, if not all, the reports were coming from the south side of town. Furthermore, the dirt road that I pulled off on to get some sleep, well, that road led to a pretty big ranching outfit, and I don't mean a dude ranch resort, but a real agricultural facility. They even had a mine out there on the property, hence the Big Mac truck that rolled by me in the early morning hours. Well, a couple of guys had been sneaking in and out of the ranch, usually in the middle of the night. They would come in empty-handed, stumble around the property until they turned on an alarm. Then they would go scurrying back out into the desert with whatever they could grab. Tools, copper, raw ore, building materials, literally anything they could sell into turning a couple of bucks. My misfortune turned into a stroke of luck for the local police department. I took them out to where my incident took place, and from there, the sheriff's department was able to track these assholes down by the end of the day. They found them holed up in a little cave in a wash that intersected with a river. They had water storage, all kinds of stuff to give them actually a livable, decent life. The issue is, they all pillaged locals and travelers like me to get it all. Not after that day, I got all my stuff back, which, as I said, wasn't really that much. Maybe 50 total, along with some of my personal stuff like blankets. I have no idea what happened to all those men, but I'm sure the camp was cleaned up. Missing items returned to owners, and everything else dumped in the trash. From there, I'm sure those dudes got locked up, and I went about my business. Like I said in the beginning, this was my first and only time stealth camping, and I can confidently tell you I'll never, ever do it again. A few years ago, my wife and I were going to go visit her sister somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. We're an older couple, but not ancient, not even retired, so we make up all trips like this pretty often. Recently though, or at least within the last 5 years or so, we've been hearing about a new fad called stealth camping. My wife and I thought this was funny as we'd done this kind of thing for years across many different states and many different cities. I'll admit we were fascinated though. We found all kinds of YouTubers and TikTok streamers, people coming up with new ways to camp in more and more populated areas. Some of the stuff that we were seeing was genius cutting-edge kind of thinking, and some of the other content. So I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead, and we started simple at first, just sleeping in the car in well-lit parking lots, then slowly transitioned into more isolated methods of camping. Instead of sleeping in a Walmart parking lot, we'd find a luxury condo, or maybe even a gated community, somewhere with a little more security. We'd follow someone inside, find a nice, non-reserved parking place and sleep away the night without anyone knowing. Dawn would come and we'd get ourselves ready, roll right out the exit gate as if we'd lived there our whole lives. It was a lot of fun and always made for some mild excitement. Now, stealth camping isn't quite the same as boondocking, which was something else that my wife and I had done. Boondocking is just breaking camp in the middle of nowhere, generally public land, and that doesn't have services or any amenities. It's essentially just typical camping. We like to stealth camp because it kept you in town limits, and you didn't actually have to get to anything set up. You got to utilize your car in a way that you normally don't get to. Well, after a year of exploring and experimenting in the great fad of stealth camping, we decided to try something new. We visited my sister-in-law. Instead of just using a car, we were going to actually find a place within town and city limits to set up a little camp and sleep outdoors. We'd seen enough videos and practiced enough on our own to feel confident we could get away with it. Looking back, I don't know what the hell we were thinking. This was some ultimate bored, middle-aged white people activities, if such a thing ever existed. Everything on this trip was going good at first. We stopped 3 or 4 nights at this point, all of which were successful outdoor ventures. Now we were actually in the city and needed to be careful with the place that we chose. After getting some food and stretching out our legs, we started shopping around for a place to set up. It wasn't long before we spotted this quaint little greenbelt behind a Target store. It had ominous fencing that didn't actually have a warning of any kind. There was grass and a line of trees, even a little hill to offer a vantage point. By and large, it seemed absolutely perfect. It would make for the most high-profile stealth camping adventure for us yet. Now, you can't just go in and start setting up full camp with people around. We'd have to make several trips to and from our car. "What's going on, pal?" "Oh, hey, come here." "What is it?" "You don't need to do this, man." We were left to do our business. We didn't have a ton of supplies or anything, but we'd like to be comfortable and didn't want to have to return to our car for any reason. As I've been saying, we took it pretty seriously, compared every step of our camping to some videos that we'd seen. We knew all of this had to be safe and secret, so we held ourselves to a certain standard. At the end of the day, though, it was a lot of fun and something to tell our friends about. The camp itself was tucked into a thicket of trees. He's about halfway up that hill, which kept our tent out of view from pretty much every direction. It was a dark nylon, two-person tent, and so small that it blended in perfectly with the surroundings. Up where the trees were a little flat area to put the tent, which also had a two-person cot inside. It was very comfortable and kept us off the ground, which did preserve our backs a bit. Again, we're older. You can't blame us for preventing the aches and pains if able to. We settled into a couple of collapsible chairs that we brought along. We spared no luxury with the isolation that we had back there. We talked in hushed voices, shared a snack, and had a little wine and just watched the sky. It was relaxing, very mellow. You almost couldn't tell that we were in the heart of a major metropolitan area. Somewhere behind us, we could faintly hear the drone of the highway, but then we heard something much closer. Tires squealing through the parking lot. The hill wasn't so high that we couldn't see over the Target building, but it was obvious that some kid just whipped in the lot, was doing donuts or something to that effect. Every time that we thought it would stop, they would just cut the wheel and gun it the other direction. It was very off-putting, but not quite enough to be scared or anything. Our car was parked out there, but there were a few other cars too. Random lot overnighters, maybe even graveyard shift workers. There was a stretch in numbers that hopefully whoever this was would be careful enough not to crash into any of the cars. It quieted down after a while, and soon my wife and I were getting ready for bed. There's something about sitting in the dark, especially outdoors, that just drains my battery. It could be 7 p.m., and I'd tell you it was midnight. I just lose all sense of time and want to be asleep the whole time I'm out there. Just as soon as we're getting ready to break down the chairs and go inside our tent, we hear that same car come ripping through the parking lot once again. Except this time, it comes to a screeching halt. My wife and I look at each other. That's new. Then we hear a car door open and shut. A second one. Then we hear footsteps. Voices. Everything is getting louder. My wife and I look at each other in total terror as two strangers pull the fence back and start wandering right into the green belt that we're hiding in. We can hear them clearly now. They aren't talking about anything nice or friendly, mostly violence and drug use. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. My wife starts to get up, but I stopped her, whispered for her to stay put. The trees had us totally blocked from view. The only way we'd be found was through sound. The less movement, the less likely that we'd be caught. She sat back, put a hand over her mouth, and just waited. Thankfully, those voices slowed down as the two strangers stopped short of where we were lingering, down in that flat area before the hill. There was a big fallen tree down there too, bigger around than a car tire and made for a good bench. I considered camping next to it earlier, but found it too close to the fence for comfort, and thank God that we didn't do that. or we would have been discovered almost immediately. Now we just listened to these guys talk for a while. Obviously, we didn't know their names, so I'll just refer to them as Guy 1 and the loud guy. Guy 1 was only a little softer spoken, but talked at such a fast speed that we had a hard time keeping up with him. I'll try to recreate as much of the conversation as I can remember. At first, they were just talking about doing drugs and getting high partying. But eventually, the talks turned into violence. Violent stuff. They'd done stuff they wanted to do, and this eventually led them to why they were out there in the first place. Damn, dude. What time is it? Is he even coming or what? The loud guy asked. Yeah, he said he'd be late. He's always late. Can't wait to do this, guy once said. Yeah, me too, man. Dude's a scumbag. Loud guy. Agreed. Now they start trailing off about how they were supposed to meet a third person, a drug dealer of some kind. They were going to rip him off right back here. Apparently, they'd bought from this guy pretty regularly, but his prices went up, and his consistency had gone down. Addiction turned to desperation, and both of those turned into anger for Loud Guy and Guy 1. Anger that they planned on using to utilize to rob the person that was causing their problems, or at least so they reasoned. We definitely didn't like what we were hearing, but our options were limited. We were outgunned against these goons, and we had no interest in running them off or tangling up in any way. I had a gun, naturally, but that was an absolute last resort. It was an unspoken agreement that we could just hide, stay quiet, and wait out whatever the hell was about to happen. The second it was clear, we'd call the police and get the hell out. The two goons kept talking about all kinds of creepy, colorful stuff. My wife ended up covering her ears because it was so gross, beyond locker room talk, but the truly heinous daydreams were over. Of the criminally deprived minds. After a while, we heard footsteps approaching from the outside. I prayed for a security guard or someone, but it turned out to be the long-awaited drug dealer. Showtime. They all started exchanging pleasantries, shaking hands. This part actually felt almost cool as my wife and I were the only ones privy to what was really going on, or at least, so we thought. The conversations then turned to business. Loud. Guy starts to inquire about their perk, and drug dealer pulls a gun out of his jacket and points it right in Loud Guy's face. What the hell, man? He screams. You didn't say you'd have a gun. There's a lot I didn't tell you. Guy 1 says, now empty out your pockets. This whole exchange was a double setup, as Guy 1 was never gonna rob the drug dealer. What was actually in cahoots with him. Then the second gun came out, a shouldered up and Loud Guy immediately realized that he was done for his own. The option was to get louder and louder, which for him came pretty easy. They didn't let it happen though. My wife almost gave us up when the drug dealer pistol whipped that Loud Guy not once, but twice. It got really quiet. Guy 1 rolled him over, started working him over, checking his pockets, then literally hog-tying him. Loud Guy started to grumble again. I would thought they were friends. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Guy 1 took a filthy rag from the culvert ditch and stuffed it inside his mouth. Talk about cold-hearted. After that, drug dealer and Guy 1 went through the contents of Loud Guy's pockets. They even took his shoes and his socks off, where I guess the real haul was found. From what we could hear, they came upon $900 in cash, half an ounce of cocaine, and also had piano wire in his pockets, apparently a tool of his. Then, the worst thing that you can imagine happened. My wife's whole body lurched, her eyes went wide, and she let out the loudest sneeze that you can imagine. I froze, totally shocked at what just happened. My first instinct was to say something like, "What the hell?" But I knew that would only add to the fire that we just started. She put a hand over her mouth and nose and did her best not to breathe. She has wicked allergies in the Pacific Northwest. We had forgotten all about it in the moment, and now it was too late. It just got us busted. I watched through the trees as all three heads, Even the guy tied up on the ground slowly turned up to look in our position. The drug dealer even briefly pointed the gun up at us. We didn't move. We didn't give up exactly where we were. We knew the hill was dark and shrouded, especially where our tent was. Much to our surprise, the drug dealer and Guy 1 started to backpedal towards the parking lot. They shouted a few threats, talked some tough guy shtick, and even threw some more shade on Loud Guy, who's still tied up on the ground. My wife and I kept still as they slowly disappeared through the fence and around the side of the building. They hopped inside Guy 1's car, the squealing menace from earlier, as we realized we never actually heard the drug dealers arrive in a vehicle. We surmised that he must have walked from some nearby location to eliminate loose ends. The car tore out of the parking lot, left us alone in that green belt. Alone, except for Loud Guy. He was aggressively rolling back and forth at the bottom of the hill. We could hear him grunting, struggling to get free, but it was no use. After 20 minutes or so, he finally gave up, panting, face down in the dirt. I honestly think he passed out from exhaustion. My wife and I wasted no time, immediately started breaking down camp. The chairs first, then tucked in all our loose equipment into the cooler, like a big stacked up pile. We took the tent apart as quietly as we could, careful not to step on anything that might give us away. Once that was rolled up, we were ready to break for our car. We heard something though. Loud Guy was starting to fight with his bind knees again. Except this time, he was clearly making some progress. It wasn't more than a few seconds later, and suddenly his arms were free, which moved down quickly to get his ankles undone. Soon, he popped up muttering to himself, brushing the dirt off his clothes. My wife and I were frozen. We had no idea what the hell to do. We were already scared enough at just the prospect of trying to walk by this dude, but now he was up and free. He took one final look around the greenbelt, then bolted for the parking lot. We stood and listened to his fading footfalls until we couldn't hear them anymore, then stood and listened some more. We weren't in much of a rush to get caught by any of these people. It was just by pure luck that none of them had come up the hillside to see who or what we were. Once we were positive that everyone was gone, we huffed all of our stuff out to the car and dialed 911 and hit the road. My wife made a full, thorough report, all except for the fact that we were camping behind Target. The dispatcher assured my wife that lots of calls came out of this part of town. Apparently, we've been trying to camp in one of the more crime-ridden areas of the city. We'd never heard anything more about the trio of drug-dealing turncoats. And believe it or not, my wife and I continued to stealth camp after that. We just upped our game, like we always do. We do way more research now, as the internet has made it much easier to avoid crazy encounters just like that. That night, we caved and got a hotel, just to avoid any further chaos. If you're going to stealth camp, be careful. Be quiet, be careful, and be prepared for anything. When I was a kid, my dad and his buddy would take me out woodcutting deep in the Montana wilderness. My dad's friend, Uncle Kermit, drove this ancient, dilapidated truck that you could literally see through the floorboards of. The wheel wells were completely rusted out, the exhaust was chewed through, and loud as hell. It was an iconic trailer park menace, almost stereotypical for where and when we lived. Dad and Kermit brought me along. Not only for my benefit, but under the guise of making me a man. The real reason was they'd have a young, able-bodied, sober hands on site for most of the grunt work. When I was really young, I think 9 years old up until about 13, I'd be the log hauler. Dad and Kermit would slog through the area, bust everything up with their saws and axes, and I'd put it all in piles and then take it back to the truck. This made sure the adults could keep moving, keep buzzing logs, and keep drinking beer, all without lifting a finger to load the truck. By the time I was older, not only was I a resilient log hauler, but I had to drive too. By the time I could see over the wheel, My dad and Uncle Kermit would take full advantage and really get to drinking. This was in the 1980s, in the middle of nowhere, Montana, so as long as the driver wasn't drunk, local deputies didn't really care if I had a license or not. They knew one option was better than the other, so I got more responsibilities out of it. I didn't really mind though, because driving the truck and handling chainsaws felt pretty cool to my teenage self. There was one particular trip where everything seemed to be going wrong. Storm clouds rolled in when there wasn't any forecast for precipitation. Then the truck started acting up, chugging at first in town, and then we realized the transmission itself was completely shot. You could shift through the regular gears, but downshifting was really hard. Shifting into regular reverse was damn near impossible. It just wouldn't slip. So we're stuck in a rambling old truck that could only go forward at only certain speeds. We were begging for trouble, and we'd find plenty of it out there that day. Everything was going per usual. 3 of us were spread out about 10 feet, each equipped with a chainsaw and buzzing everything up in sight. I wasn't as quick as the older guys, so add that to the fact that I had to pile up everything. I fell behind really quickly. We were walking along a hillside that gently sloped up to my right and then down to my left. This was my least favorite kind of terrain, short of straight uphill, I guess, because gravity worked against me. Anything that got away from me just barreled down the side of the hill, gone until I had to retrieve it. My dad and Uncle Kermit disappeared up ahead, through the brush, and then over the hillside. I could still hear their saws, though, roaring through all manner of deadfall. It was easy to keep track of each other, and the chainsaw, saws made for good security. They were so loud that no predator wanted to get within a quarter of a mile of us, and if they did well, were 3 guys with chainsaws. We weren't really that worried about animals getting the jump on us. I came up on this absolutely massive old oak tree sprawled out through some still standing pine. It was the kind of haul that would take more than one trip with the truck, so I just went to work turning out the outer limbs into nice logs before turning my saw in the trunk. It was a gnarled tree, so I knew it was going to turn my hands into pudding, running that saw through it. Still, I started turning the trunk into rounds. There were a couple of knots up ahead, but I was on autopilot at this point, just trying to finish the minimal wear to my arms. I set the blade between a couple of the knot holes, hit the trigger, and let the sawdust fill the air around me. I could feel some rot in the wood, empty spaces where the blade passed through much quicker. After the saw padded through, I brought my boot up and kicked the round as to separate it from the rest of the tree so I could take a better look. This was the worst mistake of my life, as when I bent down to investigate the rot, a whole swarm of bats came screeching out of the hollow. They were beating against my legs, flapping up the inside of my flannel, even tied up in my hair. It was something right out of a movie, and a horrific one at that. I froze up immediately, and had the bats passed over me quicker, I probably would have been fine. I was surrounded, though, as I felt myself begin to suffocate on wings and fur everywhere. I turned, and panic set in. I started to stumble backwards. The hill itself sloped down and away, so as I moved backward, I started to fall. As I did that, my hand tried to find something to grab onto, and the only thing within reach was the handle of my chainsaw. I squeezed the trigger, got the blade chain spinning, and then ran the whole saw through my right calf. It was the worst pain I've ever felt, truly blinding, as I felt the teeth pull through my skin, then the fat, and finally the muscle. Blood erupted as if I tapped a fire hydrant, literally spewing down my leg and spurting through the air like a little sprinkler system. It was spraying out multiple places, so different streams shot in different directions. I imagined my veins and artery chewed to bits, so I figured there would be no way to stop the blood. I collapsed in the underbrush and just laid there for a minute, letting the shock wash over me. Things were bad, but I couldn't tell what the damage was yet. Had I broken something on the fall? It sure felt like it, and my leg was a mess. I checked myself for bites and bats and made sure they were all gone. Next, I checked out my fingers, my arms. My elbow was racked really good, but I couldn't tell if it was broken or not. It was jammed up enough that I couldn't use it to stand back up though. The chainsaw was laying behind me, idling hard, chain just a few inches from my hip. I reached over and hit the kill switch, then used my good leg to kick it a healthy distance from me. Again, I tried to use my bum arm to get up, but it was completely shot. The brush had enveloped me in such a way that it was almost anchoring me to the ground. So between my bum leg and bum arm, I wasn't going anywhere. The only option was to wait for my dad or Kermit to loop back and find me. This took way longer than I was prepared for, but felt like an hour went by. I couldn't even hear their saws anymore. I figured they were drinking and waiting for me to catch up. I started hollering through the trees calling for help that I was injured, no haul or back. It was late morning at this point. Well, I wasn't worried about overnighting or anything like that, but I was aware of how much blood I was losing. More time passed. I couldn't tell you exactly how much midday came and went. I was still alone, losing body temp now and starting to smell my own wound. I was starting to entertain the idea of death when I heard my dad calling out, and I quickly shouted back, "Try," to where I was. I could see them through the trees, maybe a quarter-mile away. I kept shouting and started shaking near branches to show them exactly where I was. My dad finally got a beat on me, started busting up the hill. When he saw what happened, his face went sheet white, and he almost collapsed. He started screaming for Kermit to get up there, so they could get me shouldered and carried back to the truck. The old man wasn't as spry as my dad, plus he was completely drunk, so he really had to fight up every step of the hillside. Finally, though, he got to me and realized how bad it was. Between the two of them, they slung all 3 saws and the rest of the gear and my 14-year-old self through that forest and back to where we parked. This is where we had to make some hard decisions. Because of where my wound was, I wasn't able to bend my leg, so getting into the cab was not an option. I was going to have to ride in the back of the truck, and someone would probably have to ride with me to keep me from sliding around too much. My dad was a medic in the Army in his younger years, so elected to stay in the bed with me and treat my leg as much as he could. That left Kermit to handle the wheel. But like I said, earlier he was drunk. Uncle Kermit was drunk the entire time that I knew the guy, literally sun up to sundown around the clock. Boozing, leaving him to drive us down a pretty steep mountain road through the woods and finally into town was more dangerous than it sounded. The only advantage Kermit had was that he spent the last 60 years living rough and rural out there in Montana. He knew every road, every hairpin, like the back of his hand, not even just the roads, but the terrain and all the changes in between. He could walk from one town to the next and never take a single step off course. His sense of direction was really unbelievable. My dad got me nestled into the back of the bed, near the back window right behind the passenger seat. He cut my pants away and did what he could for my leg, elevated it, wrapped it with clean cloth, and then applied pressure. We didn't have a full first aid kit or anything, so what he could do was pretty limited. Meanwhile, Kermit did his best to get the truck fired up, then did circles until he got turned around and sat on the right road home. Remember, we didn't have reverse, so we had to be careful where we pulled in and parked. Then we were off, sailing, navigating that old piece of shit through all manner of mud, muck, and washouts. This wood run was during autumn, and in Montana, fall can get pretty cold, being in the back of that truck without a coat. I started shivering not long into the drive. My dad did what he could to bundle me up, but with the wound, my body was just shot. I needed to be inside and getting treated. Every bump sent me into hysterics from the pain, and fresh blood would start gushing out all over that dingy metal of the back of the truck. When it started to pool so much that it was filling the grooves in the bed, my dad really set to work on it again. This time, he had much better luck, as whatever he did stopped the bleeding up much more effectively. It hurt like hell, but it had my leg plugged up for the time being, as long as I didn't move too much. Things almost seemed like they were going well for just a moment, until suddenly the entire truck just veered off the road. We're blasting through a ditch, lopsided as hell, with branches. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a truck in front of me, and I can't see it. I can't see it. I can't see it. Down the mountainside. There was probably a more legitimate medical diagnosis for this, because he would literally pass out with a moment's notice. You could be talking with him, middle of the day, his eyes would be closed, and he'd start snoozing right there in front of you, standing up and everything. It was kind of hilarious and always a sight to see. With that being said though, it was a danger on the road. Anyone who was friends with Kermit knew that driving with him was a fool's errand. Either you had to be the one to drive, or you had to be alert enough to shake that old man awake the second he would fall asleep. That just became our new top priority, even above the fatal gash in my leg. If we crash the truck, everybody dies, not just me. I saddled up so I had both elbows hanging out of the bed, kinda wedging myself in place, but also had my left palm ready to bang on the driver's side window if my dad was by my legs, trying to keep them still, but also perched and ready to pounce against the glass the second Uncle Kermit nods off once more. It was hairy, scary, and everything in between, man. Being a kid, I actually felt guilty more than anything back there, like I put us in that situation. I felt at fault for putting us all in danger, so I wanted to do as much as I could to help avoid it. We got another couple of miles, which, on a downhill mountain road, takes much longer than a city or a town. Uncle Kermit fell asleep again, and I mean full head snap, chin to chest, snoring everything. We both saw it immediately and started wailing on the glass. Thankfully it worked and woke him up. It woke him up so fast that he didn't know where the hell he even was, and waved out the window like there was oncoming traffic or something. I had to laugh. Some shit just never changed, no matter what the situation was. After 2 more times, we were almost at the foothills of the mountain. It was only a 10-mile haul, but when you're going back and forth at 15 miles an hour, it does take a while. There was one big last curve before the grade straightened out and started to dip into the flatlands that would take you back to town. There were a few small communities between us and the hospital. Nothing that would be able to stitch me up. However, along that last curve, Kermit fell asleep, and he didn't wake up when we banged on the glass. The truck started to swing wide, really gain momentum around the bend. It was obvious that we're going to roll, and I mean any second now. The back tire already felt like it wanted to lift off the ground and get the whole thing going. I watched in total disbelief as my dad fell asleep. Dad threw open the back sliding window of the truck, dove through the gap, and got control of the truck enough to straighten it out. His legs were kicking in the air above me, kinda like some crazy dream sequence. When Kermit woke up this time, he was furious for some reason. "What the hell, Dale? What are you doing?" he yelled. "You fell asleep again, you old dipshit. You almost flipped the truck. Hit the brakes and let me drive before you kill us all." My dad yelled up at him. That seemed to bring him back to reality. He guided the truck to a stop just before the road straightened out. Dad got behind the wheel and Kermit slid into the passenger seat. I did my best to batten myself down for what I figured would be a crazy flight to the hospital. And it was, at least at first, a little nook of town popped up in a couple of houses and a gas station and a bar. When Dad slowed down and started rolling his window down, I leaned over to see what was up. He gave me a quick, hard look. "How's your leg?" he asked. I looked it over before answering. "It's not bleeding, but it's hurting pretty good." I said. He nodded. "You want to get a beer before we hit the hospital?" Whoa, if I thought driving in chainsaws was cool, this whole new pinnacle of the word stop for a beer with my war wound. You better believe it. I said yes, and Dad guided the truck into a little nosedive called Crazy Woman's or something to that effect. To this day, it's one of the smallest bars that I've ever seen. Inside was dark, dingy, and the bartender was covered in cat hair. We sat at the bar and Kermit ordered us 3 beers, to which the keeper obliged. But he gave me a funny look when he set the bottle down in front of me. Right away, he started asking questions, saying I didn't look old enough to drink. This was a setup of some kind. My dad cleared it up really quick. He nodded down to my leg, which I quickly brandished through my ripped jeans. As Dad explained my grisly wound, the bartender lit up, totally blown away that we would take the time to get a beer, so blown away that he didn't charge us for the round, wished us luck, hoped it wouldn't have to get amputated. My dad, Kerman, and I said thanks, and then hopped in the truck, blasted off to the next town. We ended up stopping at 3 more bars before we made it back to town into the hospital. It was simply too good of a bar trick not to cash in on. Absolutely no one would care once it got stitched up, but right there. It was good for at least 3 beers. I wasn't even old enough to drink. My wound was all the identification that I needed, as this was a bit of a different time. Alas, when I finally got to the hospital, they stitched me up in no time. It turned out to be a pretty superficial wound. I went through a lot of fat. My dad did a bang-up job of treating the wound with what he had. I didn't lose my leg, thankfully. I only damaged my liver a little bit, but I can say I survived. I lived in Tucson during my years as a young criminal. I didn't bother graduating high school. I moved right to working the street, which is really only half truth. I was a party animal who only moonlighted as a criminal. I ran with small crews of guys that I've been friends with for life. They were all involved in different aspects of criminal activity, everything from stealing, robbing, racketeering, even working as a border fencer. We're a coyote for those who don't know. Some of these guys could go down to the border and get paid $5,000 a head for every single person they brought over illegally. The work always varied, but always paid in stacks by the end. Well, after a few years in the street life, I find myself very close to actually living there. It turns out we weren't particularly talented criminals. We made enough to stay fed, stay high, and party. But only a couple of us had a place to stay. Rob had an apartment in a sketchy neighborhood on the south side, and Juan rented a little dumpy house not far from that. The rest of us either crashed with them or other friends, or with girls that we were dating at the time. At this point, half of us were on probation or evading warrants and charges, so mostly just laying low in the way of work. The things that we were doing was a lot of drug dealing. We ran a tight circuit throughout our neighborhood. We had enough of a roster to keep supplied and secured. No one sold anything without giving us a cut between one street and another. That's just how it was. At this point in my life, I thought I was at my lowest. Little did I know that in just a year or 2 after this incident, half my friends would be dead or in prison, and I'd be living on the street dodging people who intended to murder me too. It didn't feel quick while it happened, but looking back, it was almost overnight. It's like the old metaphor about the frog in the pot of water. It'll never jump when brought to a slope. It was me in the pot though, and I couldn't tell the water around me was already at a simmer. Anyway, I was living between 2 apartments with 2 different girls that I was dating. They did not know about each other. This was a little personal scheme that I was running. I had no interest in a long-term relationship with either of those women. This just made it to where I had a safe place to crash, cash in my pocket, and food to come home to. Dating these women was my version of a safe house. Judge me if you want, but it served its purpose and everyone was happy. One night, we were all holding council at Rob's apartment, as we normally did. It was up on the 3rd or 4th floor, so it had a nice view of the neighborhood and let us feel like underworld royalty. Honestly, The place was a dump. Stained walls, holes in the drywall, dirty floors, burned carpets, the whole nine. It was a cross between a crack shack and a frat house. It was headquarters, the party place, and where we'd hang out on days we didn't want to do any of that. One night, we were counting money and talking business, but everything just kept coming up short. Our average rake for the week was usually double whatever it was we had on hand, so we knew something was up. That's when, in passing, our friend Moose mentioned that we saw someone dealing in our stretch of turf. He didn't do anything about it, as Moose was one of the guys on probation, so we just followed the guy back to his house and got a visual on that place. Looked like a pretty average apartment, no outside decor except for a smoking chair. We all took great interest in this, and a select few of us hopped in Rob's car to go scan the place. A few others laced up to do a walk by. The rest of us just stayed at the house, ready to roll out at any sign of trouble. Moose stayed back, and as did I. He filled us in on what he'd already seen, as he staked the place out for a couple of hours the night that he found it. He said it was average traffic. A couple of people would come and go every hour. Pretty obvious some kind of sale was going on. Others would come and stay a little longer, then eventually leave. Then sometimes randoms would leave the house, people he never saw enter, which told him there was at least some kind of assortment of crew inside, more than just dealers probably. A couple of hours later, we got our answer. The people on foot got back first, then Rob barreled in with the car, parked around back to keep it off the street, and hustled up to the apartment. Our buddies on foot had already filled us in a bit. They did a little stakeout of the apartment. When they were sure sales were being made, a little group of guys approached the door and knocked. They pretended to be looking for a pickup. The people in the apartment let them right in, at which point our crew hardened up. A couple even drew guns. They unlocked the door behind them and let in even more of our crew, who ransacked the place, and then everybody fled. They issued a warning before they left, though. This was a claimed area, and no one would be stepping on us. Find somewhere else to conduct business. With that, everyone retreated back to Rob's. They did it carefully to avoid being followed back. What they came back with was in the ballpark of 25 zezens worth of street value. I'm talking pounds on pounds of weed, ounces of cocaine, and piles of all kinds of pills. It was the exact kind of come-up we were looking for, and it was between crews, so it's not like our probation officers were going to hear about it. Ripping off a dealer isn't like knocking off a 7-Eleven. Repercussions are between people and the laws they decide for themselves. Well, over the next 8 months, our crew completely fell apart. A bunch of us got caught up in a raid over at Juan's house. The others got picked up on corners and back alleys making deals. Those who didn't get jammed up by the law ended up catching beatings, or even all at the hands of who we assumed was the other crew that we ripped off. Word was that the guy that we ripped off wasn't just a little street team like us, but an extension of a real gang somewhere in the valley. They were coming to test the waters in Tucson, as they had affiliation with cartel associates. This means these guys were not to be trifled with, but we had no way of knowing that. We were way too quick on the trigger, and after the night that Rob and the guys ripped them off, it sealed our fate. They made one call. The cartel honchos had our number. It was dicey everywhere. Very quickly, we realized that nowhere was safe. Even of the girls that I was shacking up with, it got wise that times were seedy. She gave me the boot. I couldn't really blame her, but damn, I was pissed at her. People are getting locked up or killed, and you shut the door ruthless. But again, I get it. There weren't many of us left by the end of those 8 months, whittled down from 20 to just 5 or 6. It was hard to tell, though, because more of us were scattered to the wind every single day, getting out of town, or at least out of the neighborhoods before things got any worse. It felt like hunting season was on, and we were the only game out there. We couldn't sell drugs anymore. No one would do business with us of any kind. I mean, we could get little things here and there, but the big transactions, forget about it. There was no way for us to get ahead anymore. Definitely no work coming our way. It's like we were wanted. So putting us to work would be like painting a target right on your back. We just continued to lay low. Every now and again, we would get together at Rob's apartment, get drunk, and just shoot the shit. We compared notes on stuff that we'd heard, what went on through the hood, and just general counsel. It was a true wonder that this place never got raided. We'd somehow kept it secret this whole time. There was a small victory in that, even if we lost everything else, and lost we had. The guys that were left were getting seriously desperate. Most of us had jobs, even throughout the criminal string, even if it was just working the register at a gas station. Now that's all we had, and even then, none of us wanted to work too local for fear of getting recognized. We needed to more satisfy the habits that we had, let alone cover overhead. Some of the guys were talking about going back to dealing, maybe on a different side of town, but others were talking about even more drastic action. Break-ins, robberies, ATM holdups, jam up a stash house like when we started this downhill spiral. Anything to turn a real dime just to come up a little. That was against the rules though, and we knew it. The agreement was to lay low for just a little while longer, and eventually start popping up individually. It'd be easier to get in somewhere alone, without a crew, without working alongside the prior team. Shedding the reputation would help us all in the long run. I'm not sure that ever even came to fruition. Exactly 1 week later, I was supposed to go over to Rob's house and just kick it for the evening. I was hanging around with a girl that I was still seeing. She and I had actually gotten more serious because the other girl had walked. We spent more time together, got more intimate. Soon, I was hanging out far more than I ever did before. It was nice having more than just a physical relationship, but to actually hang out and share meals, watch movies, all that good stuff. It was the perfect thing for laying low. I got to stay home every single day and enjoy myself doing it. Well, the girl and I ran the clock, and I was getting late over to Rob's, but only by 15 minutes. I was walking over there, and as I was leaving the house and during my trek over to Rob's, I could hear sirens here and there. I don't know why, but it just gave me this weird feeling. They were all heading in the direction of Rob's apartment. I continued walking that direction, certain that it was just a coincidence. But lo and behold, his whole complex is taped off in every direction. The block is swarming with cops, detectives, heavily armored tactical teams, even canines. Brothing up and down the sidewalk, it was damn near like a mini war zone. I called Rob for my cell, but there was no answer. Now I had to see for myself what the hell was going on. I walked around to the back of the building where there was a plain metal door that allowed access to the building itself. It was kind of blocked by some bushes on the outside. Some genius had also painted employees only in stencil across both sides. It made it look halfway official, and no one ever really used it. Hell, there was a time that building was being torn through by cops, and we got some of our friends out through that door. It was just a little-known secret of long-time renters. I got in, but didn't even make it to the stairwell before some cops busted me. They didn't draw guns or anything, but they were stern, very serious about how the hell I'd gotten inside. I told them about that door. I gave up the secret exit of the ages and explained that I was just here to visit my friend, and he wasn't answering his phone. I said I was late, and I had a bad feeling about whatever the hell was going on. They asked what unit he was in, and I said the number. Both guys shook their heads and said sorry, that's who we're here for. I was devastated but not shocked. Like I said, the second I heard those sirens, I just had this bad feeling. And now I had the confirmation. Both the cops said something weird then, said, hey, since you know the guy, why don't you give us a statement, so we'll have somewhere to start. It'll really help the investigation. Maybe get some justice for your friend. I said okay, and they brought me up to his apartment. I wasn't allowed to go inside, but they told me what they thought happened. Someone had entered the complex. Ulex came straight up to his unit. They knocked once loud and hard, waited for Rob to open up the door. The moment that he did, they discharged a 12-gauge shotgun 3 times in rapid succession, which effectively cut my friend in half at the waist. Now I was in shock. It was the worst thing that I ever heard in my entire life, and as you can tell, I wasn't very sheltered. I gave them the cleanest version of a report that I could, short of the robberies and drug dealing. I told them about a local crew who had that cartel affiliation. They moved drugs in bulk, they were armed, and they've been involved in lots of violent activity in the city over the last year. I even told them where the original apartment was. The detectives wrote everything down, but the moment that I mentioned the cartel, they didn't seem super interested in a follow-up. I got the hell out of that town, and I mean that night, with clothes on my back. I don't know. I told my girlfriend what had happened. She swung by to pick me up, and I told her to drop me off at the bus station. I was catching a ride out of Tucson. She asked me where, and I said I was going anywhere away from the border. I had to hide for at least a couple of weeks, but in reality, I disappeared for a couple of years. I found myself on the streets of Flagstaff, half for a short stint, where the weather got real and the cold sent me. Packing Phoenix caught me next. I lived on the streets for almost 10 months. I even turned myself in for some minor crimes just to get on probation, have a routine, and have a check-in. In my mind, I was still being hunted, so being on a radar was good for me. That also gave me a peace of mind for anything catching me up down the road. I was on and off inside 18 months, and I found a room to rent inside that time. Rob had a lot on the hook. He was one of the few guys in the crew that actually had a roof over his head. So he had rent, a car payment, insurance, utilities. The guy had real bills. It wasn't just parties for him. So when everything dried up, he got hit the hardest and became the most desperate. He rolled a couple of those corner guys, rolled the stash house, and eventually somebody followed him home. Can only assume that they were part of that original crew that we ripped off to begin with. Here is the scariest part, at least for me, and this isn't even me speculating, but exactly what those detectives told me the night that Rob was murdered. They said, had I been on time, I would have walked in literally minutes before the shooter arrived to the building. When they knocked, they would have shot us both point blank. Absolutely no doubt about it. They said I was incredibly fortunate to have been late that night. It literally saved my life. That's why I was so desperate to leave that night. I knew that my luck was not going to last. When you survive something like that, you don't keep living the same way. You take a serious inventory of what you have and what you want and what you value, and then prioritize from there. Rest in peace, Rob, and everyone else not around from those days. Those days, during COVID, my entire life fell apart at the seams. Money quit coming in. We couldn't leave the house. My wife and I were already growing distant. Her son and I have never been close. Jan and I got married late in life when Luke was already born and pretty much grown. I knew him as an angry borderline, violent young man who was a bully throughout his time in school, a vandal to the public. I don't think I ever saw him smile. Hand to God. The kid was never happy or in a good mood at all. He was like the kid out of a cartoon, with just a thundercloud over his head all the time. When I stopped working, we all got cooped up in the house, and things spiraled out of control. We couldn't talk to each other, let alone look each other in the eye, after just 6 or 7 months. Everyone drank, everyone smoked, and the place quickly grew very unstable. I knew things wouldn't last, so I started quietly packing my things, planning my escape. I'm a plumber by trade. I have no trouble finding work, so when things opened back up, I quietly saved my pennies. By the end of the first COVID year, I had a decent little stash of money, and I had totally rehabilitated our old motor home, which was one of those old trucks with the camper on the back, but fully outfitted it. It was going to be my chariot to freedom. Things had gotten crazier than a shithouse rat in our home, though. I fought with Jan every single day, screaming matches, shoving matches, all the crap that leads to jail time. I wasn't about it. I didn't want to fight with anybody. Luke was even crazier, spending every waking moment on the internet. He'd gone from a high school bully to a stereotypical conspiracy theorist. Everything was a government cover-up, a chemtrail, a Chinese act of terror. He lived in a fantasy land, and because of that, had grown even more violent and unpredictable inside our household. More than once, our interactions turned physical. Once, while we were having an exchange in the kitchen, I just simply turned my back to him and went back to my business. I was done with the conversation because it was going nowhere. I opened up the fridge to get something to eat, and this kid comes up behind me, my own stepson, and wraps me up with both arms, squeezes the air out of me, and pulls me back closer to the counter. He threw me to the side, slammed the fridge door closed, took out a knife out of the block. He then threatened me at knife point, saying that we don't eat under the same roof, and all this other batshit fringer elitist alpha shtick that he gets off the web. It was scary as hell being picked up like that. I'm obviously older, but also a good deal smaller than Luke. He could have killed me if he wanted to, with or without that knife. I just went limp after he hoisted me in the air, like I was already dead or something. But I could feel something more than that. I could feel how angry he was. I don't know how, but I could just feel his animosity and how badly he wanted to injure me in that moment. It was really bizarre, and I've never felt anything like it since. Another time I was bringing in groceries. Jan was berating me for not getting enough or not getting the right product, some other minor inconvenience. I snapped back and defended myself. Then here comes Luke, barreling down from the upstairs bedroom, immediately smashed his forehead into mine. This was just as I was turning around from the car trunk, arms loaded with groceries, so I couldn't really defend myself. He clocked me so hard that it rattled my teeth, totally shook my brains up. Then he pushed me hard enough that I fell back into the trunk. From there, I panicked, as I'm very claustrophobic. A new Luke would be crazy enough to shut the hatch and lock me in there. I dropped the grocery bags and scrambled to my feet. Just in time as I saw those gears turning, he realized then he could have done it. I told him that I was calling the police, at which point he and Jan cooled off and went back inside. I brought the groceries inside, but made sure to avoid them both for the rest of the day. After that incident, I made leaving my top priority, above even getting divorce. I finally told Jan what was going on, that I wanted to leave, as well as get separated, but she wasn't having it. She took right back to berating me, saying that she would never sign anything and would never do anything to spare me any difficulty. She wouldn't lift a finger if it meant making something easier for me. All right, so be it. Anything is better than here. I took my last of my belongings and drove the motor home right down the road. I didn't really have a plan for that night, but I had a plan for my future. I milled around the city for a couple of days, got my road legs under me, and learned the ins and outs of trailer living. It wasn't so bad. I kinda liked being able to relocate at a moment's notice. After 10 days, I stocked up on some supplies and jumped the border into Mexico. I spent that first night on a beach, didn't even know the name of, drank beer that was pretty much free, and saw more stars than I've ever had in my entire life. Life went a little weird for the first couple of months, but freedom tasted so damn good. As I mentioned before, I'm a plumber, so there was still work everywhere. Lots of people needed living, little odd jobs done, and they would pay me in all sorts of helpful ways. I got to know people in my community, even learned a little